Again, I want to thank everybody for joining us for today's live webinar. We are going to go ahead and get the session started. The audio portion of today's session is being recorded. For today's agenda, we'll do a quick welcome and introductions and talk a little bit about who Astrix is, why we feel like we have the right and the experience to be talking to you about these topics today. We're going to go through LIMS selection, talking a little bit about the differences between an enterprise approach versus a point solution approach. And then we're also going to be doing some case study reviews and then again a live Q&A. So briefly, who is Astrix? First and foremost, we're an informatics professional services and staffing company. 100% wholly dedicated to the scientific community. In terms of a background of the company, how we came about, we were established in 1995 and are privately held. The company, however, originated as the IT division of a company called APBI, which is a $300 million life science research organization. Today, Astrix has grown to over 500 employees, and we operate out of 8 offices throughout North America. Our headquarters are in Red Bank, New Jersey, and we enjoy annual revenues in the $40 to $50 million range. We predominantly operate with 2 divisions. The first one, the staffing division, it offers private and public staffing of primarily scientific and IT resources. The professional services division, the gentleman who'll be putting on today's session, is focused very heavily on supporting science-based organizations, especially around initiatives such as implementation of LIMS systems, selections of LIMS systems, and other laboratory technology. At the end of the day, a lot of the pro-serve is around helping laboratories really understand and implement a sound IT strategy within their labs. The clients that we work with, life science enterprises, we could just go back one slide again real quick. Government and research institutions, Astrix does a lot of work in the government sector, and large and fast-growing IT staffing companies that have heavy compliance needs. The mission of the company is always to deliver scalable, sustainable solutions in IT and staffing, again, specifically for the scientific community. So real quick, the technology partners we work with and the industries we focus on, it's going to be kind of the usual suspects. It's those industries that are highly regulated and operate with highly regulated workflows and integrations, particularly technology integrations. We offer best-of-breed solutions and approaches for folks in the pharmaceutical, the biotech, cosmetic, petrochemical, environmental, food and beverage, again, industries that are going to be operating with very highly regulated workflows and IT systems. The technology partners and the platforms that we have expertise in is quite broad, and it is really kind of a who's who in this sector. There's, of course, Thermo Fisher, Waters, StarLIMS, Dotmatics, LabWorks, Core LIMS, and LabVantage. These are the companies that we have extensive expertise in and bring that expertise to the table in our presentations and materials like today. So with that, I'd like to introduce you to Robert Walla. He's a principal and co-founder of Astrix Technology Group. Robert is going to primarily be your presenter for today. Just a brief bit of background information on Robert, and I'll let him introduce himself in just a moment and have him take over controls. Robert is responsible for essentially the growth and the strategic direction of the professional services division. So again, the group that is really heavily focused around helping labs with their IT needs. He brings over 20 years of experience in lab informatics, including overseeing large global informatics projects. And he comes to us with a BS in chemistry from Rutgers University. So Robert, if you'd like to introduce yourself, I'll turn the session over to you.
Kevin, thank you very much. Welcome, everybody. Thank you again for joining us this morning, this afternoon, again, depending on where you are. What we're going to do today is really dive deep in looking at different methods for evaluating and selecting a laboratory information management system. And we're going to compare kind of 2 different approaches. One is a traditional approach that we call point solutions, and then we're going to look more at an enterprise approach that companies have been embracing over the last couple of years. I have some case studies that we'll take a look at and evaluate, and then really kind of present the best practices of the way to go about doing this. And as Kevin had mentioned, we're going to have a Q&A at the end, so please feel free to type in any of the questions you may have, and we'll make our best attempt to get to all of them. But if we can, we'll certainly get those out in an FAQ document. But before we go ahead and get started, just so we can kind of get an understanding of where everybody here is in their LIMS journey, we're going to have our first poll.
Yeah, and really, folks, the poll will be open for about 10 seconds, so you definitely want to take a quick look at it, add in your response there, and what we'll do is we'll also launch the results of the poll. So as soon as we close this out, again, what we'll do is we'll present these results back to you. So again, the choices are: you currently have a LIMS, no plans to replace; you currently have a LIMS, but you're considering replacing in relatively short time period within the next 6 to 12 months; no LIMS, but you plan to purchase within a certain time frame, 6 to 12 months; and then, of course, no LIMS with no plans to purchase. So it looks like we have the bulk of the results have come in, so we'll go ahead and close that, and then we'll share those results with the group. So it looks like 50% you currently have a LIMS, no plans to replace. Around 21% came in at currently have a LIMS but are considering a replacement, and then 14% across for no LIMS and might purchase, and no LIMS and no plans to purchase. So appreciate that. We'll go ahead and put those results away and hand it back to you, Rob.
Great, thank you, Kevin. Thanks everybody for participating in that. Okay, before we get started, we're going to talk a lot today about an enterprise approach. And before we get into that, maybe we'll just, to get everybody on the same page, have a little bit of a definition about what enterprise is. And even if you're not in an IT group or an IT department, you've probably heard the term enterprise systems in the past. And if I was able to take a poll right now and poll the group and say, okay, what does that mean to you? I'd probably get responses like big, complex, expensive, business-focused, and all of those would actually tend to be correct. Generally speaking, when you talk about enterprise software, is really software designed to meet the demands of large organizations. These systems are large-scale software applications that really focus on business processes and in complex types of data analytics in organizations like that. But one component of enterprise systems is that they're held to a higher standard than most other desktop applications, for example. So higher requirements for availability, reliability, scalability, security, etc. And you may have heard this within your organizations, where maybe you've made a suggestion to bring in a certain software, whatever that may be, and your IT department say, well, we can't really install that because it's quote unquote not enterprise. This is really what they're talking about. So specifically speaking, if you really said, okay, what systems are considered enterprise, and I've got several of them here on the screen right now, typically business types of applications would fall into the enterprise category. And there's several of them up there, a lot with acronyms that you may or may not have heard about before. But if you really broke those down, let's take a CRM, for example, customer relationship management. I think everybody here probably has heard of Salesforce.com. That's a customer relations management system. It really helps an organization manage its customers and its sales pipeline, orders, etc. Another one that you probably are familiar with is ERP. The very popular one there, obviously, is SAP, where many of your organizations may be running that, or companies that are running that. But really, all of these systems here kind of focus on business processes primarily, and certainly a component of them is that they're big, they're complex, and they're expensive. SAP, for example, if you've ever been involved in an SAP implementation, that will go many, many, many years. Typically longer than 2, and will cost in the tens of millions of dollars to implement. And bigger organizations even approach a lot more than that. But one thing that certainly is missing from this list is laboratory informatics applications. So if you're in the sciences like we are, you're used to dealing with the lab informatics ones. We're going to talk about LIMS specifically today. You see that that's not on the enterprise list. And there's a variety of reasons for that. I think typically when people that run companies, manage companies, and they think of systems in the laboratory, they think of them as point solutions. And I think historically that has been true, but we're going to talk today about how that is changing. Okay, I think we're going to do another poll before we jump in and talk a little bit about kind of the traditional approach.
Yep, we're going to go ahead and get that launched right now. So you should see up on your screen how many LIMS are currently implemented in your company. So first and foremost, 0. You don't have a LIMS system. 1, 2, or if you have 3 or more different LIMS systems. Don't worry about whether or not they're integrated or not, just to get a sense of how many different individual systems you have within your organization. It looks like we've got a few more results coming in here, Rob, and then we'll close this out.
Yep.
And then let me go ahead and share these results with everybody. So 1 came in as the leader, and then behind that 0, and then 3 or more for the 14%. We sincerely send sincere condolences. And then for the 2 systems that came in at 7%. So we're going to hide those results, and then back to you, Rob.
Great, thank you, Kevin. And we'll talk a little bit about, you may be asking, well, why would anybody have more than 1 system or 2 or actually 3 or more? And we'll get into a little bit of that, but really what we want to do now is kind of get an understanding of where everybody resides as far as LIMS systems. So again, thank you for participating. Okay, a little bit about the traditional approach to selecting LIMS systems. In the past, and LIMS have been around for over 20 plus years now, obviously, and they've always been really seen as a kind of a point solution and implemented as such. And what we mean by that is it's implemented to solve a single problem or to really support a limited part of the organization. And maybe you've seen this in your organization. So for example, we've done work with a lot of companies that have had LIMS systems, and when you start to talk about, well, how did your LIMS system come about? Often we hear, well, we put it in place, we implemented it because we all of a sudden had to do electronic reporting, for example. So we never had a LIMS, we were using paper, but this new regulation came, or a client required electronic deliverable, so we had to put a LIMS system in there. That's an example of putting a LIMS system in to solve a single problem, and that's fine, but that doesn't necessarily utilize a LIMS to its fullest capability. Or a LIMS was put in for a limited part of the organization. We see this a lot when we deal with some of our clinical clients, where they have a very large sample management group, and that's kind of run and standalone, by itself. And in order to manage the large amount of samples that come into a clinical type of an organization, maybe they'll put a LIMS in to help that. But that does not get extended in the other part of the organization. It doesn't drive workflow. It's really for a limited part of the organization. So typically, that's what we've seen, since LIMS have really become, commercialized until about a year or so, a couple of years ago. So some scenarios, how does this come about? Variety of different ways. You see this a lot in mergers and acquisitions, okay, where you have a company that's using a LIMS or more, and they acquire or merge with another company. Now all of a sudden you have multiple LIMS systems out there doing different types of things. This is also a very popular type of a scenario in decentralized operations, meaning that you don't have one organization like an IT group that is looking out for the different business units and where maybe a LIMS may or may not make sense, and really where business units are making the decision on their own. You also run into this in what we call hyper-growth organizations. So organizations that are growing at a rapid pace. It's almost like they don't have time to stop and take a breath and plan, the best way to implement the LIMS. It's like, hey, we got to go, go, go. So, this group is going to implement this LIMS, another group is going to implement another LIMS without really talking to each other. And then the ever popular rogue groups, and we see this a lot. We'll do work with companies, and we'll see they have a couple of different LIMS, and we'll just ask the question, how did this come about? And often we hear, well, we had a LIMS and we were looking to implement it, but this group just went off and decided to do something on its own. It's had its own budget, it was managed separately, and they went ahead and implemented a LIMS. Another very popular way that you get point solutions. So what's the result of this? You go about a point solution way. You'll find a LIMS, certainly. It will get implemented, but often what you find is you have a redundant technologies, typically multiple LIMS systems. And based on what the poll said, a good portion of folks here on this call are in that type of a scenario. But often what you see with this is conflicting technologies. Maybe they don't operate together, they can't operate together for a variety of different reasons. But really, you know, the end result of this is that you have LIMS systems that doesn't necessarily meet the entire needs of the organization. And you often quickly outgrow this, because what you'll find is that LIMS are there, they're kind of being used in a silo. As a company starts to grow and get into really building out collaboration and sharing of data, those LIMS systems typically don't work, and now you're in a situation where you're looking to do a replacement. You know, and that's all fine, well, and good, but there is certainly a cost associated with this. And you know, here are estimated costs that we see and we've put together for just the implementation of a single LIMS system. You know, typically, there's some sort of evaluation selection process that goes on, and this may be something that you do internally, or maybe you hire a company to help you navigate that process. Then obviously there's a cost for the licenses and the services, and I base this on about a 30-person laboratory, picking one of the standard commercial LIMS systems out there. What we typically see is services are at least the cost of licenses, sometimes higher depending on your integration and your configuration. There's hardware cost, maintenance that you pay to the vendor on an annual basis. That's for 1 year, but that $45,000 will be paid every single year. Training is certainly a component of it. And if you're in a validation environment, that could really add the cost. That's an estimate. That's probably about middle of the road estimate. We've seen validation, double or triple that, again, depending on the organization. But at the end of the day, depending on the type of organization you are, you're looking anywhere between, $750 to close to $1 million to implement, quote unquote, a point solution. So, it's expensive. There's a lot of ramifications doing it, and if you don't do it properly, it could certainly add to the cost, the overall cost. Okay, I want to talk a little bit about a case study with a global biotech organization that we've done some work with. This organization, like a lot of biotechs, multidisciplined, research, development, manufacturing groups. And these are one of the hyper-growth companies. Over the year that we had been working with them, they added over 1,000 employees in 1 year. Tremendous growth. And because of that, they were really a decentralized type of a company. They had a corporate IT group that managed their enterprise applications, ones that we've talked about before. But the business units were responsible for selecting, implementing, and really managing the laboratory applications. And they went about it on their own. And all of these LIMS systems were purchased using a traditional approach, basically looking at the needs of the business, not really reaching out to any other parts of the organization to see if they need a LIMS or had a LIMS, anything that could be leveraged, basically kind of going through this the process with blinders on. And as a result, over years, they became the proud owners of 4 different LIMS systems. One interesting thing was one of the LIMS was used by 2 separate divisions there, but they were totally in different configurations. They were almost like different LIMS systems. They were actually purchased and implemented independently, even though they had selected one that the company was already using. And the estimated cost of this, and this is what was told to us by this company, they figured they've spent over $7 million over the period of a couple of years to procure, implement, and provide services to this. So, really when you look at it from a single LIMS, yeah, it's around $1 million, but that can certainly add up over the cost of several LIMS. Okay, before we move on into a different approach, I think we're going to have our third poll right now.
Yeah, and the third question is, how was your current LIMS selected in your organization? So, there's kind of 3 scenarios here. Number 1 is, was it just done informally, meaning did a group of folks within the lab get together, do a little bit of research, pick a couple of vendors, bring them in, etc. Or was there a more formal process using internal resources, meaning did you have IT involved, did you have procurement involved, did you have a formal RFP or RFI, or did you take all those processes and source them out to a third party? So those are our options. We'll go ahead and close the poll out, and we'll have a look at the results. A few more results coming in, and we'll go ahead and close it. So to have a quick look, Good news, obviously, there's, formal process came in overwhelmingly at 70%. That's great. That means, obviously you're involving multiple departments, multidisciplinary in nature, and, going through some pretty rigorous procedures. 23% came back as following similar, but using a third party to help, and then informal process came in at 8%. So we'll go ahead and hide those results, Rob, and we'll pass it back to you.
Thank you, Kevin. Okay, let's talk a little bit about the LIMS enterprise approach. As I mentioned before, this is something that we have been talking to clients about for a long time, and over the last couple of years, it's starting to get more traction. LIMS, as I mentioned, have been around a long time. A lot of LIMS systems have been purchased and implemented in those 20 years, but now companies are looking to do a different approach. And the question I always look at is like, well, why now? It's been around for quite some time. A couple of reasons. People that we've talked to at all different levels of the organization. So I'm talking about lab managers, directors, C-level types of folks, chief operating officers, et cetera. Why are the companies looking at this more holistically now? And really, the ones you see on the screen, the ones that we hear a lot, concerns about lost data. And I put lost in quotes. Not that they don't know where it is, they certainly know where it is, but just inability to get at that data or use that data and compare it to other parts or other metrics that they have in an organization. And as companies now talk more about collaborating and using data that has been collected in the organization to drive decisions in other parts, the ability to get at data and to use it properly is becoming a very, very big concern. A lot of times it's because of some regulatory audit. An FDA or an organization like that would come in, find some issues, and mostly around data integrity. The inability to track data from or samples from the beginning, to the end, and tie the data together. Gaps there has been a big issue, and if you're in that type of an environment, the FDA over the last several years has really been, focusing on data integrity, and during audits, questioning about that, how an organization, can tie all of its data together. Cost of ownership is another one. I think you saw on the last slide that you go down a point solution, you can really spend a lot of money very quickly. So cost is a big component of why companies are looking to do this kind of more holistically. And I think a big part of it is timing. Many companies, and you may be there as well, you've had LIMS for a while, maybe you're on your second or third LIMS, and I think that a lot of people that are owning this now, whether that be IT directors or business unit managers, they've been down the path of selecting and replacing because maybe they did not do the proper job at a past in a past position, to look at the bigger picture. So it's almost like now we're at Laboratory Informatics 2.0. So a few best practices here. So really what companies are doing prior to purchasing a LIMS, and really this goes for any other scientific application as well, we're speaking LIMS specifically, but it has a broader appeal. Companies are taking this enterprise approach and performing a holistic assessment. So what we mean by that is not just looking at, okay, here is our laboratory or our area, and what does this group need, but taking a step back and looking at areas corporate-wide to see either, hey, can we leverage what we're going to be doing here across other parts of the company, and really leveraging our capital, or is it a situation where we may need one or more types of technology? So okay, we need a LIMS now, but will we need an ELN down the road? And if that's the case, well, we better start planning for that now, because maybe that drives the selection of the LIMS. Or what types of visualization tools are we going to need if we don't have them? That can certainly make affect how the decisions that you're making right now. And really the goal here is to develop a 3 to 5 year informatics roadmap. And how people are getting started is performing what we call a phase 0. If you've ever been in a LIMS project, or really any other types of informatic projects for that matter, it's always about, well, first phase we're going to do this. We'll configure the LIMS. The second phase we'll integrate it with instruments, and third phase we'll extend it and put a web portal on it, for example. Well, really, those phases are fine, but they're actually a phase before in order to make sure that you select the right one, and often referred to as a phase 0. When you really think about this, it sounds like a great idea. Why wouldn't an organization want to just kind of take a breath and step back and, make sure that they evaluate all aspects of an organization prior to making a laboratory informatics decision? And really, we've seen it for a couple of reasons. It's almost like, well, we don't have the time, need to get the LIMS immediately. It's like the ready, shoot, aim approach, as I call it. It's a lot of times, and we see it with development as well, it's like, well, we don't have time to write specifications. We have to get the coding. But you don't do that in a lot of other parts of your life, right? You would never think about building a house before you have blueprints, right? So, really, it's to take the time to do that will really help you down the road. Another reason that we see is really lack of resources. Organizations, everybody's busy. There's not a lot of people sitting around doing nothing in most organizations, and to try to find the time to do that could be an issue for some organizations. But one thing we always say is that if you don't have the resources internally, certainly look externally, because there's companies, and Astrix can certainly do this, help you kind of organize a phase 0 and at least get it started for you. Companies often don't have limited vision into what the future looks like, and it's always like, well, the landscape's going to change. Why go ahead and do a 3 to 5 year plan? Well, really, the plans that you do 3 to 5 years, they're meant to be living types of documents. It's not saying, okay, we're going to put this in place and we're going to figure out what we're going to do year 2, year 3, et cetera, and that's it. We'll lock it in. It's never going to change. Of course, it's going to change. And if the organization changes for whatever reason, that's fine. But it's good to get that on paper initially, and then as the organization changes, modify the plan. And then obviously there's always a cost component. It certainly would cost to do a phase 0, whether you're going to use internal resources or hire a company like us to do that. But I think you saw previously that if it's not done correctly and you do it as a point solution, you could certainly wind up spending a lot of money. $7 million was the first case study. Certainly the cost of doing a phase 0 is nowhere near that. So it's almost like you're investing money to save money down the road. Okay, phase 0 approach. What are the components? Certainly evaluation of current state. You always want to do that. You take a look at the applications you're currently using, how they're being used, what areas they're being used in, and not only that, but the processes surrounding that, okay? Because really when you look at kind of an enterprise approach, you typically look at both the application and the processes, and both of those can change or be modified over your 3 to 5 year journey. It's definitely, you want to have an end goal in sight. Where do you want to be? What are your goals and objectives for that future state? And it could revolve around many things. It could be objectives based on productivity. It could be objectives based on quality. It could be based on growth. There's a lot of different goals and objectives. All organizations are the same, but the important thing is that there needs to be a consensus there. That needs to be documented, because the plan will always reach for both of those. In this phase 0, there's typically a requirements type of definition. Now, if you've done informatics projects before, requirements definitions can be very granular and take a long time to go through. Typically, at this stage, you're at a high level, more business requirements than anything else. Okay, what is the application that you have? What is the LIMS going to do? What is it doing now? What's the goals of it once you start to implement it and go down your 3 to 5 year plan? Evaluate process changes. There's always processes that typically get changed in these types of plans. So you have to evaluate that. What's the ramification of that? Right now maybe a LIMS system that you're using in a certain area with a process, doing a certain process is fine. If that process change, does that application have to change? Do resources have to change? All of these need to be considered. And then potentially a preliminary vendor evaluation. If you don't have a LIMS system, or if the LIMS system isn't necessarily going to meet the needs of the organization, often companies will do a preliminary evaluation just to see what is out there and the types of LIMS that could potentially meet the needs. And then once all of these evaluations are done, it's typically documented, an analysis and a selection of a solutions options. And what I mean by solutions option is, how are the systems or processes going to be implemented to solve the needs of the organizations? And this could be more than one. Typically it is. Where you would say, okay, we're going to implement the LIMS for this organization this way. In year 2, it's going to be now configured for this part of the organization. And all of those need to be analyzed and documented and part of the plan. I've talked a lot about multi-year plans. Typically, we look at it from a 3 to 5 year perspective. One thing we always suggest in year 1, once you lay out the roadmap, is don't make it too difficult. Look for quick returns. And this may be very simple. Okay, well, we have a LIMS system and we're using it in one part of the organization. We're just going to extend it to, one other part of the organization. Now, there may be more down the road that it gets extended to, but, take small steps the first year. Or if you're going to be modifying processes, make sure that it's manageable, it can be done, it can be measured, and, you can show that you're getting some quick returns on the investment. Years 2 to 3, it gets a little bit more involved, and this is really where you're going to be setting your foundation for the future growth in year 4 and 5. So this could be implementing a new LIMS if the current LIMS system is not meeting the needs, or if you don't have a LIMS system. Or it could be further extending that LIMS into other parts of the organization. And then years 4 to 5 is really where you're implementing, additional technologies, and that's for future growth of the organization. Always part of the phase 0 approach is some cost analysis, okay? In order to do whatever the roadmap looks like, whatever you come up with, what is going to be the cost, both from an out-of-pocket perspective as well as from a internal resource perspective. And then there's the value proposition. How do you justify this so when this is presented to management or folks that are making the decision, you're able to secure the funding that's needed in order to put that roadmap in place? A couple of different ways to do this. One area that we find very effective, or an approach that we find very effective, is what we call the value engineering approach. In the past, it was all about showing, return on investment. Well, we spend this much money, we think we're going to have this much savings, so, here's how much we're going to save over this period of time. Now we look at it more from an approach of, how does implementing a system really tie back to the value drivers or the KPIs of an organization? So on the left-hand side of the screen here, you see some of those. You see value drivers, or, the KPIs at a corporate level, return on investment, minimizing risk, increasing innovation, typical, corporate types of drivers. But what we work with companies to do is then decompose that and to look at, okay, well, what are the opportunities that tie to each of those value drivers, and even further break it down into specific types of initiatives. And once you get it at that level, then you could say, to the right there, parts of a LIMS system or another type of technology then can really help drive that initiative, which goes back to how it helps the opportunity and eventually show how it ties back to the value driver. This value engineering approach, we could talk about this in a webinar by itself, and actually we do have one plan, but I wanted to touch on it here to show that, an enterprise type of an approach, is new. Companies are starting to do that, and really looking at how a technology, a LIMS system, will benefit an organization is being changed as well. It's not just about, cost versus, what the output is versus what the return is, but really is about how does that LIMS system drive value throughout the organization. Okay. Last case study here. This is for a clinical diagnostic company that we had got involved with and started to do some work with. Multidisciplined, multi-site again type of an organization. When we were engaged, they were running 2 LIMS systems currently, and actually were about to go down the path for a third. There was a group that had requested a different LIMS system. Their initial approach was to upgrade the current LIMS they were working, so they're going to go through 2 upgrade paths. They were LIMS systems that were running for a while, but they were a little bit outdated. They were going to go through an upgrade of those LIMS system, and then actually go down and perform an evaluation for the third LIMS system. But in discussions, as we started to talk to them a little bit about a phase 0 evaluation, more of an enterprise approach, they decided to take that option. And at the end of the day, they decided that the third LIMS was not necessary. They were able to consolidate their two existing LIMS systems in one, and they estimated in the first year they saved about $2 million, both from not having the cost of upgrading the LIMS and the out-of-pocket expense for evaluating and purchasing a third LIMS system. So certainly, again, kind of taking a breath, stepping back, looking at it holistically can certainly streamline organization and save quite a bit of money. So before we wrap up today, I think, Kevin, we're going to have our last poll.
Yeah, we are, and it should be launched up on everybody's screen. Has your company performed or ever discussed going through a phase 0 type of evaluation? 3 choices. Yes, you've done them in the past. No, but you've discussed doing them in the future, and not familiar with the type of evaluation. So those are up there, and we'll give that a few more seconds, and then we'll go ahead and close that poll out. Just a few more answers coming in. Great, we'll go ahead and close that and share those results with everybody. So no, not familiar with the type of evaluation, came in at 46%, not uncommon considering the audience we have on today. Phase 0 type of evaluations tend to be much more of a formalized project management IT approach. So we tend to see that in organizations that have done routine IT-driven implementations, so no surprise there. 31%, yep, you've done them in the past, that's great. And then no, but you've discussed doing them in the future came in at third. So we'll go ahead and hide those results and let you go ahead and finish up here, Rob.
Okay, thank you, Kevin. Really, that was the last thing I had. So we'll open up for questions. But yeah, I agree with you, Kevin. I'm not surprised at that, because this type of approach at the laboratory informatics level, so at where you would evaluate and select LIMS, has not really been around for a while. Companies really, I said, over the last couple of years are really starting to embrace this. I think it's as a result of going down the point solution path over the years and buying a LIMS and buying another one, and replacing a LIMS and replacing another one. Now it's really time to kind of look at how they've been doing in other parts of the organization.
Yeah, no doubt, and certainly there's a lot of external drivers out there that are pushing heavily on organizations, IT organizations within life sciences, and heavily regulated. And that's, of course, data integrity, validation, movement to the cloud, which certainly is a topic that can be probably sliced up into 5 or 6 webinars. So there's certainly a lot happening technologically in the laboratory space these days, and getting a sense for some best practices around how to go through these evaluations, we felt obviously was very important to kick off our webinar series with. But as I mentioned, we will be getting into other topics as well. There are a few questions that popped up throughout, and I wanted to tackle them real quick here, see if I can get these. Again, I won't read the name, I won't read the organizations. One of them was, it seems like companies are starting to think more along the line of enterprise, but are the LIMS vendors also thinking that way as well, or are they continuing to develop point solutions?
That's a really good question. Short answer is sort of. There are LIMS vendors out there that are starting to take this approach. And you may hear some LIMS vendors talk now more about platforms and collaborations and things of that nature. And these are the companies that are looking at it now more as an enterprise type. They're not there yet, and certainly not every LIMS vendor out there is thinking along those lines, but you're starting to see more. And even we're familiar with many of the LIMS systems out there, and I speak with a lot of the executives at these companies, and really what you're starting to see internally is that more people are coming on board to LIMS vendors that are from the quote-unquote enterprise world. So now LIMS vendors have people that used to work at SAP or Salesforce, and they're really bringing on people that have the enterprise mentality, and it's starting. But I think over the next several years you're going to start to see more and more take this type of approach.
Appreciate that. One other one had popped up here. How long, I guess in time, I think that's what they mean by this, how long does it typically take to perform a phase 0 assessment?
Well, the short answer is, well, it depends on the organization. But And it really does. To give you kind of some metrics, we've done phase zeros for company, in about a 6-week-ish time frame, and others go months and months and months and months. It really depends, obviously, on the scale of the organization. But this is something that we have a discussion with the client initially. Just to point out, it may not have been clear. Sometimes phase zeros are done. You look at the big picture and say, okay, we want to dive into this part of the company first, and then we'll kind of slice up the phase zeros and put them all together. But they can certainly be done in a couple of months, but others will take several months to do.
Okay. One other question come up, and it was our organization is very fragmented and dynamic. Does that lend itself to doing an enterprise approach to technology?
Yeah, that's a good question. It does. I mentioned it a little bit earlier, a few slides ago, that sometimes companies don't do this, or they think about doing it and never really get started because they say, well, we change so much. And the goal of a phase zero is certainly to lay out the roadmap, but roadmaps change. And we always say that it's good to get it down on paper. So everybody knows what the plan is, but that it is a living, breathing document, and really requires some governance. So it does require, somebody that's going to own that, own the document at the end, own the roadmap. And as companies start to go down that path and, maybe do year one, at some point in time, whether that's a year or 6 months, again, depends on the organization, you can say, okay, well, where are we? We did this a year ago. Are we still the same type of company? Did we have a merger? Did we, buy a company? Where are we now? Do we still look the same? If yes, that's great. You keep going. If no, well, then it really wouldn't take that much time to tweak the roadmap, to take into any changes that may have taken place, since it was originally done.
I appreciate that. Yeah, so those were the main ones. There was a couple that were specific to vendors, and for these sessions, we try to stay away from any kind of endorsement or discussion around a particular LIMS vendor. I mean, that may come down the road, and certainly your feedback in the survey will help us direct that if we want to spend particular time on a particular vendor. But obviously, we try to stay objective and neutral in those. So with that, we're going to go ahead and get wrapped up here in just a moment. In terms of getting in contact with us, so Robert was kind enough to put his contact information. If you have questions that maybe you didn't feel comfortable or didn't want to ask to the group, but you want to ask Robert individually, he's happy to take your question. So his email's up there, rwalla@astrixinc.com, and his phone number's there, and certainly the link to our website. Why get in touch with Astrix? I mean, if your organization is obviously going through any kind of a consideration of major changes to a LIMS, new LIMS, first LIMS, etc. I mean, certainly that's where Astrix's primary expertise lies on a professional services side. So we're a tremendous resource for a lot of organizations, large and small, who leverage our team to help them down that path, whether it's straight up implementation of a LIMS or selection, phase zeros, through tune-ups and checkups and audits of a LIMS that's been in place for many, many years. They're kind of like a teenager's closet in their bedroom. I like to say they get cluttered over time, and every now and then you got to take a long, hard look at what's in them and see about cleaning them up. So with that, we'll go ahead and wrap the session and the recording.